Yeah, someone said I don't even need it, but it does help if you are sitting in the back. Well, you're welcome to move forward. I'm a little lonely up here. For those of you who may not know, my name is Don Ralston. I am the senior adults pastor, and I'm a retired pastor, so some people, at times I think I'm just a tired pastor. But it is good to be here and a chance to share the message this morning. Pastor Steve is with his wife at a conference, and he asked me to preach today, and I look forward to it anytime I get the opportunity. I've chosen a scripture out of John. We are in a season, what we call Eastertide. That is the time between the Resurrection Sunday, Easter, and Pentecost. And so I chose a passage that's familiar to many of you out of the 20th chapter of John, verses 24 through 29. One of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. They told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he replied, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side." 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. And the doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. And then Jesus told him, "You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." Now, after reading this passage, I'd say that not much has changed in 2,000 years. Good old doubting Thomas is a lot like many of you and like me. Now, let's not be too hard on Thomas. Why were the other disciples believing? Exactly. They had seen it with their own eyes. The preceding verses tell us that. This is verses 19 and 20. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. And suddenly Jesus was standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. And he spoke. And he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side. And it says they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. As you can see, Thomas wasn't there that first time. And nothing like this had ever happened before. Can you imagine? Would you have believed? "If only I could see him too," Thomas says. If I could see his hands, and if I could put my hand into the wound in his side, then I'd believe. If only. If only. You know, we tend to be a lot like Thomas, don't we? If only. If only I could pray like you fill in the blank. Or if I could lead a Bible study like, or if I hadn't done this, or if I had done this, if I'd married, or if I hadn't married. But how do we live with the if-onlys? That's the challenge that many of us face today, isn't it? Years ago, we found, Donnie and I, my wife and I, found a little saying in one of C.S. Lewis's books, his Narnia series. Many of you have probably read C.S. Lewis' Narnia series, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's a children's fantasy. If you've never read it, I'd encourage you to check it out. It's for children, but it's better for adults, to be honest with you. And in it, in the first books, there are 4 children who go into this land of Narnia. And the youngest is named Lucy. And in the second book, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, she is talking with Aslan, who represents Jesus in the story. And she asked him a question. What would have happened if she'd done something differently? And Aslan gives her this bit of advice. You'll never know what would have been. How many times Donita and I have been talking and one of us says, well, if only we, and the other one will say to, if only, we'll never know what would have been. You know, that's life, isn't it? If I had only done, if I hadn't done, you'll never know what would have been. In our scripture, we see Thomas had his if-onlys, didn't he? But his if-only became a reality. The scripture says that the following Sunday, 8 days later, the disciples gathered again in that same room. There was now one more present in their company. Now Thomas is there. Again, Jesus suddenly appears, and he speaks the very same words as the first Sunday. Peace be with you. And then he turns to Thomas, and without any comment or anything, he says, now, Thomas, put your finger here. Look at my hands. Put your hand in the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. Now, Thomas may have been a slow starter, but he was a great finisher. He makes this giant leap of faith, I think way ahead of the other disciples in a sense. Did you catch his statement of faith? He didn't ask, he didn't, oh, okay, I'll do it. He just says, my Lord and my God. This is really the climactic expression of faith in John's whole gospel. My Lord and my God. The first part, first stated belief we find in John is way back in the first chapter. If you go and are familiar at all with it, Nathanael is talking and he exclaimed about Jesus when he spoke to him about something. He says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. That's a pretty good statement, even in the very beginning. But Thomas is even a more Christian statement. My Lord and my God. Now, if we could only experience something like Thomas, if we could see the wounds in Jesus' hands, if we could maybe place our hand in his wound in his side, or even if we could just see Jesus, we'd have more faith. We'd be different, right? Or would we? I'm not so sure. You see, there were some eyewitnesses to the resurrection who didn't seem to be changed by it at all. Now, who were they? Now, that weren't the women who came to anoint his body that morning. They came and found the grave empty, and they ran back to tell the disciples, and I think they were there in the upper room that night. It certainly wasn't Peter and John who ran to there and we know went even into the tomb to look for Jesus, but later were confronted and met with him more than once. But you remember there were two. There were a couple of Roman guards watching the tomb, sent there to be sure that no one came and stole the body of Jesus. They were the only ones who witnessed the stone rolled away and Jesus coming forth from the grave. These are the men, the forgotten men of Easter. It was only these soldiers who were the eyewitnesses to that very stunning scene. It was an impossible happening, but it happened. And now what did they do? Did they fall down and worship Jesus? Absolutely not. They ran back to the authorities, reporting what happened. They were paid a bribe, the scripture tells us, and that bribe was to keep them quiet. And so the event became very hazy in their minds. Now, I can't prove this because the scripture doesn't tell us for certain, but I marvel at the fact that the only two eyewitnesses to the greatest event of history apparently died as unbelievers. Yet the word got out. Jesus met with his disciples, and a glimmer of faith took hold and still takes hold of people today. Why are we here on a Sunday morning at, well, forgot my watch? 10 minutes to 10. There's only one reason you're here. Because Jesus rose from the dead. We would never have heard about him if it hadn't happened. People oftentimes blame God for not making faith easier. For God making himself not as obvious as he could. Philip Yancey, one of my favorite writers, wrote some time back in Christianity Today, the three events, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, were surely tremors in the cosmos, yet carried out so mysteriously with such a strange assortment of witnesses, they forever complicated faith. He goes on, he says, they gave just enough reason to believe for those who, like the disciples, chose to believe, and just enough reason not to believe for those who, like the Roman guards, chose doubt. That too has not changed since Jesus' time. I love that little sentence let me repeat it. Did you get it? Just enough reason to believe for those who, like the disciples, choose to believe. I want to be one of those. Some time back in the late 1700s, two Englishmen by the name of Lord Lyttelton and his friend Gilbert West were talking about the claims of Christianity. West was an avowed deist, and Lyttelton himself was a skeptic. They both agreed in rejecting the Christian faith. And they also agreed that the two strongest pillars of the Christian faith were the resurrection of Jesus and the conversion of the Apostle Paul. If those two pillars could be disproved, Christianity would soon fall to the ground. Now, these men were scholars. And so they decided to each write a book. Lyttelton chose to write on Paul's conversion as recorded in the book of Acts and to say that it was a made-up story. And West sought out to prove that the Lord's resurrection was a pious myth. These scholars worked diligently for weeks and months. And then they got back together again, and Lyttelton asked West how he was doing with his study, and West commented, "The more I examine the evidences for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the more I am convinced that the gospel story is true and that he actually rose from the dead, and my book must now prove that." Fascinating, isn't it? Lyttelton then said he too had found that he came to believe in Paul's conversion, and his book would prove that. Then Jesus told Thomas, you believe in me because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me." To Mary and Peter and John and Thomas, to all the other disciples, the sight of the risen Lord was granted. And friends, your faith and my faith does not rest on sight or smell or touch. Our faith rests on the Word and the promises that it is true, and it rests in the call of the risen Lord upon your life and mine. In the beginning, we are to believe and trust the witnesses of those who have seen and believed. Look at the early church in the book of Acts. These people didn't follow a myth or a ghost. Many of them lived and even died for the risen Lord. Most, if not all but one of the disciples were killed because of their faith. Would they die for a story made up? There's an old song, you know, as the senior adult ministry, I have a lot of old songs. But it's one I learned in Sunday school, and it speaks to really what I'm trying to share with you this morning. It goes like this. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. Patient and loving. He's waiting and watching for you and for me. And the chorus or refrain goes like this, come home, come home. You who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling. Calling, O sinner. That's me. Come home. Verse 2 says, why should we linger when Jesus is pleading? Pleading for you and for me. Why should we wait and heed not his mercies? Mercies for you and for me. And I don't know about you, but I need God's mercy. Come home, he says. Come home. Oh, for the wonderful love he has promised for you and for me. Though we have sinned, he has mercy and pardon. Pardon for you and for me. You, Thomas, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. That's us, folks. We've maybe seen God work. We've maybe felt the hand of God on our lives. We may have felt God's direction in our lives. But we need to have faith in one we cannot see, but who rose again from the dead. 2 weeks ago, Pastor Steve surprised us, didn't he? We had communion in the middle of the month. How about that? And wasn't that a wonderful time to celebrate? And he reminded us that communion isn't only about coming and confessing our sin and receiving the mercy that we heard about here in the song that I read to you. But it's also a time for us to dedicate ourselves, to commit ourselves, and in a sense, recommit ourselves to him. And how important that is. Because in reality, God can be seen in this world. In you, and you, and you, and even me. As we seek to serve him. As we give our lives to him. And so, in a minute, when I invite you to come to receive Holy Communion, I hope that you will reflect upon not only the confession of, Lord, forgive me, but that you would say, Lord, I give myself to you. Use me, that God and Jesus Christ might be seen in the world through me. I've asked Adam to sing this morning. I think he's going to sing. You're going to lead the group, or you're going to sing it?
I'm going to sing.
Okay.
The band will be joining me.
All right.
Along the way.
And as he sings, I invite you to reflect upon the words that he sings as you come to receive Holy Communion. All to Jesus I surrender. All to him I freely give. I will ever learn to trust him, in his presence daily live. So, Adam, would you sing? And as he sings, we invite you to come and to receive Holy Communion as you feel led. Come.